Hello everyone, this is Ben, and in today's video we're going to take a look at the question of whether or not the Bible condones slavery. And the point I want to make in this video is that the Bible does not condone slavery, and in fact it condemns it quite clearly. So we're going to split the talk of this video into two parts. One part will deal with the Old Testament law, and then the second part will deal with the teachings of Peter and Paul in their epistles in the New Testament. So, the first verse we want to take a look at is in the book of Exodus, the 21st chapter, the 16th verse. And it says this in the ESV. I'll read, I think all of my quotes will be from the ESV. It says, "Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death." Now, some translations say whoever kidnaps a man, and like in the NIV and the NASB say kidnaps a man and sells him, and the ESV and the King James say steals a man. Now, let's think about this verse. It says, "Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death." Now, when I guess skeptics or people of atheist mindset, when they read that verse, they immediately think that what that verse is saying is that if you steal someone's slave, then you should be put to death, because it says if you steal a man and sell him, then you shall be put to death. And that does sort of make sense. But the problem is that that is very dependent on the flavor of the word steal. Because if you use the word kidnap, which would basically be the same action, then we would immediately think in the flavor of that word, that's grabbing a free person and forcing them into slavery or selling them and that kind of thing. So which view is correct? Because most Christians read this verse as a clear condemnation of slavery, which would be profound for the Bronze Age, amazing in the Bronze Age that the Bible actually condemns slavery. It would be way ahead of its time. So the way the atheists like to read this verse is that when it says steals a man, it doesn't actually mean just any man. It means steals a slave. So that's a problem with the atheist view, because if the book of Exodus wanted to say whoever steals a slave and sells him, then it could have said whoever steals a slave and sells him. It didn't have to say whoever steals a man. It specifically chose a generic word for just any man. So the question is, what if the person that is stolen is not a slave? And why didn't he use the word slave? So like, for example, we'll go back to the beginning of the same chapter, Exodus 21. It says, "Now these are the rules you shall set before them. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve you for 6 years." Notice it did not say when you buy a Hebrew man, okay, he shall serve you for 6 years. And it's important to note that when it says when you buy him, this is you actually pay the man that you're buying. You pay the slave the money. So it's not like you're buying him from someone else. Alright? Alright, so verse 12. "Whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death." Well, in this case, does this just apply to slaves? Does it just mean whoever strikes a slave so that he dies shall be put to death? And so you see the problem here. And so the only way the atheists can make their case is in that word steal. They can say that, well, stealing means taking someone's property. And so that would mean that, like, if you steal my bicycle, you took my property. But you can't steal me because I'm not my property, I'm me. And that's the way we use the word in English. The problem is that might not necessarily be the flavor of the word from 1300 BC that might be difficult to translate. This word is used different ways. But that's their whole case. Alright? So, in other words, like, if you murder someone, we say you took his life. which is a weird way of saying it, because, you know, I would say if you stole my bicycle, I would say you took my bicycle. But if you murdered me, I wouldn't say you stole my life. Maybe I would say it like that. Or I wouldn't say you stole me in English, but I would say that you took my life. So anyway, the question is, can the atheist get this much mileage off the word steal? Well, there's a couple problems with that. You can go to a book in the Old Testament law, the last book of the Old Testament law, Deuteronomy, which sort of goes back through a lot of these laws, and it says this in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 7. It says, "If a man is found stealing one of his brothers of the people of Israel, and if he treats him as a slave or sells him, then that thief shall die. So you shall purge the evil from your midst." So here, this is not, you're not, if it says if a man is found stealing, and it doesn't refer to just any man, like the previous verse, but it refers specifically to one of his brothers of the people of Israel. And so it says, if a man is found stealing one of his brothers of the people of Israel. Well, according to the way the atheists want to interpret the last verse, when you're talking about stealing a person, whether it be a brother of the people of Israel or whatever, the word steal makes it mean that you're taking a slave from the slave's master. The problem here is that if that word means that, then why would he go on to say, and if he treats him as a slave or sells him, then that thief shall die. You shall purge the evil from your midst. So the problem is that here the word steal clearly does not mean that you're stealing the person from his master. It can clearly mean you're stealing a free person. And so in that case, since it can mean that, and since Exodus and Deuteronomy are, in the same language, in the Old Testament law, they're both books of the Old Testament law, then there's just no reason to think that. All right. At this point, all the atheists can do is they can say, all right, when Deuteronomy says that if you steal one of your fellow Israelites and if you treat him as a slave, then you're to be punished by death. It actually the word steal does mean that you're stealing a slave from his master. They have to hold to that when the word steal is in there, it means you're taking a slave from his master. Which means that, this verse does not presume that when you take a slave from his master that you continue keeping him as your own slave. If you keep him as your own slave, so if you steal him and keep him as your own slave, in this weird way, this is a weird way of reading the verse that basically is so atheists can keep their sacred cow belief that the Old Testament condones slavery. Because back in that other passage in Exodus 21, it said very clearly, you enslave someone by force, then that's punishable by death. And so all they can do is say, well, that just means stealing a slave from his master, even though it doesn't say steal a slave, it says steal a man. So they have to piggyback everything off that word steal. The problem is you go to Deuteronomy and it talks about this, and it says, if you steal a fellow Israelite, and if you treat him as a slave, it's punishable by death. So they have to say, well, the word steal a fellow Israelite also means stealing a fellow Israelite who is a slave from his master. Because the word steal has to mean, it's all they've got in the other passage. So in other words, the word steal for them has to mean taking a slave from his master. It can, in no way can they allow it to mean kidnapping a person. So when it says steal, anyone steals a man or is found in possession of him shall be killed, executed, they have to say that word steal is the only reason and the whole reason and it is the reason why we believe that means taking a person who is a slave from his master. If they don't have that, then their whole case is shot, because now they have to say, well, the Bible condemns slavery with the strongest possible. The punishment for slavery is death in the Old Testament. So the only way out of this is to say, well, in Deuteronomy, when it talks about stealing a fellow Israelite, it does in fact mean taking him, a fellow Israelite who is a slave. It doesn't say fellow Israelite slave. It just says fellow Israelite, brother of the sons of Israel. But the word steal must, for them, must mean that you're taking a slave from his master. Now, the problem that you run into is it adds a second condition. And if you treat him as a slave, you're to be punished by death. So in other words, what if you stole him and freed him? And you didn't fulfill all of the, the explicit circumstances of this law. What if you stole the slave from his master and freed him? Well, there's no punishment given for that. So apparently that would be something that, is not punished at all and a good thing to do. And so under the atheist view, they have to say that, well, the law of Moses says that it's good to go out, kidnap slaves, and free them. The problem with that view is that the slavery for fellow Israelites in Exodus 21 is very clearly, you've got a person who needs some money, probably because of a debt, and so they say, I'll work for you for 6 years. But on the 7th year, he has to go free. Because that's what it says. In terms of fellow Israelites, it's explicit. He has to go free. And this has to do with the fact that fellow Israelites were supposed to have an inheritance of land that always was within their family. And all of the land in Israel was owned by the Israelites. So when it comes, in other situations, when it comes to foreigners, they can become slaves permanently. And there's a special provision for in the rare cases where an Israelite wants to become a permanent slave. But there's a special ceremony they have to go through and all this. Whereas, this is a voluntary agreement between the Israelite and his Israelite slave and his master. He's saying, I need this money, and I'll work for you for 6 years, you give me the money, and then after the 6th year he goes free. It's quite clear in Exodus 21. So why in the world would, kidnapping that guy who freely entered into that agreement and freeing him be something that's a good thing to do? That's like taking somebody off the job and freeing him. That wouldn't seem like a very good thing to do. He got paid to do that work, and now he's just going to get away scot-free because you forced him to get away scot-free. The right thing for him to do would seem like to go back to work, seeing how he got paid already. And they make all kinds of exceptions, like if he's being punished or like if he's being treated severely, then there's all kinds of rules dealing with that. But anyway, the bottom line is the Old Testament does not condone slavery. Now let's go over to the New Testament. All right, and so the issue in the New Testament, let's take a look. The issue in the New Testament is, since the Old Testament law commands that slavery is a sin, the question we have to ask is, why didn't Peter or Paul command Christians to free their slaves? Christian masters, why don't you free your slaves? Or better yet, why didn't he command at least the slaves to rebel? Because slavery is evil, and so why should you put up with that? It's unjust. It's wrong. You should escape. And Peter and Paul were certainly, the stories we have, they were executed as criminals. Christianity was a criminal offense. What they did was seen as criminal by the Emperor Nero, and the laws of Rome required you to worship the Roman pantheon of gods, and they preached that Jesus Christ was the only God. And many, many, many times in the Bible, they were imprisoned for their witness of Jesus and what it's over and over again. So they were okay with breaking the law for the sake of something that they believed was right. So the question is, why didn't they tell slaves to just break the law and escape their masters or rebel? Or why didn't they tell their and then on top of that, the question is, why didn't they tell the masters to free their slaves? They could free their slaves, right? Okay, so let's take a look at that. We're going to start with Ephesians chapter 6. This is a clear little teaching that'll make everything clear for us, I think. All right, so it starts with this: bondservants, or I believe it's literally. All right, so probably slaves. Slaves, obey your earthly masters. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters. So instead of rebel, he's telling them to obey their slave masters. All right, he says, with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. Okay, so that's some good obedience, right? Not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man. Okay, so the point that Paul wants to make is your true owner, your true master is now Christ, but you serve your earthly slave master as though he is Christ. So in other words, it's like what Jesus wants you to do, your true master wants you to do, is to continue to obey this earthly master. But he makes it clear that like your master is not this earthly person anymore. It's Christ. Okay, but because of Christ, you obey the earthly master. All right? Rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free. All right? Now, here's the verse that we need to not miss. It goes on to get, Paul gives a command to the masters. He says, masters, in verse 9, do the same to them, and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. In other words, God doesn't favor you over them. Okay, so let's focus on that. Look what it says. It says, masters, do the same to them. Okay, so he doesn't really, it's just one quick little blurb to the masters, and what are they to do? Well, just do the same thing the slaves did to you. But what were the slaves supposed to do? Well, the slaves were supposed to obey he gives us, it was a long explanation of what the slaves were supposed to do. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free. Masters, do the same to them. So in other words, he told the slaves to obey their masters and to do it with fear and trembling and with a sincere heart, not by eye service. Okay. So then he tells the masters, do the same to them. Well, if he said slaves, obey your masters, and then he says masters, do the same to the slaves, because to them, when he says do the same to them would be the slaves, right? So masters, do the same to the slaves. Well, he said slaves, obey your masters. And then he says masters, do the same to the slaves. So he's saying masters, obey your slaves. He's teaching human equality here. And he clearly says there's no partiality with God. And then he goes on to say, he says, don't threaten them, because God is both your master and theirs. So, in other words, how is a master supposed to force a slave to work or do this or that unless he threatens the slave? So if you can't threaten the slave, then if the slave doesn't want to do what you tell him, you're screwed. He's not your slave anymore. The slavery does not work unless you can force the person to do the thing. So it's quite clear that what Paul's saying is slaves continue to obey, but now that the master and the slave are both Christian, you have a new relationship within that household where you obey one another. We're going to be equals in this household. And so this is going to lead to some sort of democratic, setup. Now the question is well, why didn't Paul just say masters free the slaves? And which is interesting, because if we go over to 1 Corinthians, the 7th chapter, all right, Paul says this. He's saying, let each person, this is verse 21. He's talking about how whatever situation you're in, you need to stay in it. But we'll look at verse 21. He says, were you a bondservant when you were called? In other words, called to become a Christian. He says, do not be concerned about it. Or were you a slave when you were called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who was called in the Lord as a slave is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who is free is a slave of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, let him remain with God. And Paul even says, I think it's in 1st or 2nd Timothy, he says that he gives one of his lists of different types of sins which he likes to do, and he includes people who enslave other people and buy and sell slaves. He calls slavers or slave traders, are different ways it's translated. So Paul seems to want slaves to avail themselves of freedom. So the question is like, well, why wouldn't Paul just tell the masters, just free the slaves? Well, we could say, well, the slave didn't have the wherewithal to be on his own. But that doesn't hold much water, because surely the slave could find some sort of way to, maybe in some situations, or maybe at the start, it would be hard for the slave to go out on his own and support himself. But surely there'd be a lot of people who could, or at least try. Well, the problem is that the freeing of a slave, and this has to do with Roman laws, the freeing of a slave was illegal. So I'm going to read to you directly from Wikipedia. All right, the Wikipedia page, and this is the Lex Fufia Canina. In ancient Rome, the Lex Fufia, also called Furia or Fusia Canina, from 2 BC, the year 2 BC, was one of the laws that the national assemblies had to pass after they were requested to do so by Augustus Caesar. This law, I added Caesar in there. I'll read it verbatim from now on. This law, along with the Lex Aelia Sentia, placed limitations on manumissions. Manumission means freeing a slave. That's what manumission means. In numerical terms, this meant that a master who had 3 slaves could free only 2. One who had between 4 and 10 could free only half of them. One with 11 to 30 could free only a third, and so on. Manumissions above these limits were not valid. The limitations were established at the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Empire. In other words, they went from democracy to a dictator. At a time when the number of manumissions was so large, they were perceived as a challenge to a social system that was founded on slavery. Now, it mentioned another law that went along with it, the Lex Aelia Sentia. Alright, so we'll read the intro on that one. The Lex Aelia Sentia was a law established in ancient Rome in 4 AD. So that would have been 6 years later. Both of these laws basically around the time of the birth of Jesus. Alright. It was one of the laws that the Roman assemblies had to pass after they were asked to do so by Emperor Augustus. This law, as well as the Lex Fufia Canina, has made limitations on manumissions. Manumission, or the freeing of a slave, became increasingly important by the early empire. Augustus sought to enact a series of restrictions on the practice. This law stated that for a manumission to be valid, a master had to be at least 20 years old and a slave at least 30. These limitations on manumissions were made when the number of manumissions were so large at the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Empire that they even questioned the social system of the time. So the master had to be, for the manumission to be valid, the master had to be 20 and the slave had to be 30. Now the issue that this raises, there's other stuff that goes into how even if they were legally manumitted, they wouldn't be full Roman citizens. But the issue is this. Malnutrition was a huge problem among slaves. And terrible treatment. So in the ancient world, generally speaking, until we get to modern times, people lived to about 30. That was about your life expectancy. And that was your real life expectancy. It wasn't like, oh, that's the average that's driven down by a lot of people dying as infants. No, that's the real life expectancy. I'm getting that information from a Audible history lecture series called The Other Side of History, which focuses on the whole. It's like 27 hours of lectures, and it focuses on the everyday person in history instead of just the rich and powerful. And that's one of the things, is that generally it's around 30 is how long you're going to live. And if you're a woman, it's a little less because childbirth is very perilous. But life in general is perilous, and malnutrition is one of those things. If you're a slave in the Roman Empire, things are a little bit worse. So odds are you're not going to make it to 30. So this is where it becomes essential. It would be illegal for the master to free the slave. But if Paul tells the master to treat the slave well, treat him like an equal, feed him and stuff like that, then the slave's odds of making it past 30 become much better. Okay? So you see how things work. Now the only question that's left to raise is like, well, why is Paul concerned about obeying Roman laws here, given that in other situations, he's willing to spread the gospel, which is against Roman law? Well, we're just going to take a look at Romans 13 and understand that in the book of Romans, Paul has gone through a long explanation of why we all need to be Christians, and understand that according to Roman law, it's illegal to be a Christian. So what Paul says in Romans 13 is, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. This is verse 1. And those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Owe no one anything, except to love each other, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. These are Hebrew commandments. And any other commandment are summed up in this one word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. Okay, so the issue is that since Christianity is illegal, it would make natural sense for Christianity to simply rebel politically against the Roman government and set up its own government. Because the Roman government based its authority in its connection to the gods. Because every civilization to that point had had no concept of separation of church and state. Rather, they saw the gods that they worshipped as the rulers, and the ruling elites, the nobility, the kings, were also the priests and the religious rulers. And they were in charge of the nation because the gods put them in charge. So, for example, under Roman, sometimes Roman emperors would literally declare themselves a god. Or in some cases they would claim to be descendants of a god. And in the case of Roman emperors, it was believed that without the regular prayers of the emperor, the sun would not rise. Of course, Apollo was in charge of making the sun come up. I think he had a son who would make the sun come up, and so things like that. That religion was central. We see in ancient societies that the towns, the ancient cities, even in ancient Babylon and just in the ancient world in general, the cities are always built around the temple, and that the rulers, the political rulers, are also the priests. So, for example, when the Babylonians, the city of Babylon, came to become the most powerful city in ancient Sumeria, and this is going way back to Bronze Age, they wrote the Enuma Elish, which essentially was a retelling of the creation of the world, but in their retelling, now their god, Marduk, the god of Babylon, was now the chief god. And this was largely, I can't give you the reference, but the way I remember it is this was because they had defeated another city, and that other city had another god as the chief god. And so now that Babylon was politically in power, they had to say, our God is really the real God. And so that kind of thing. And so the issue is that because of things like this, since Christianity is saying that the gods of the Roman Empire are not to be worshipped, and only Jesus is to be worshipped, there's only one God and it's Jesus, then this means that they politically reject Roman rule. They reject Roman authority because Roman authority founded itself in the Roman gods. And so what Paul is saying here is essentially, you're not going to spread Christianity by force. Christianity is not going to be a political rebellion. Obey the government as much as you can is the takeaway from this. Because he's saying obey the government, but in the last, in all the previous chapters, he said be a good Christian, which was illegal. So he just got through saying at great length, disobey the government, and then he says obey the government. So the takeaway from that is obey the government as much as you can. Pay your taxes, that kind of thing. And because Christianity is to be spread by love, it's to be spread by, it's a religion of ideas. We're not going to force people to become Christian. And so that's why Paul is not going to say slaves rebel against the government or masters, break the law and free your slaves. But rather, what you do is you find a way to work things out within the law as best you can. If the master and slave are free, then you treat one another as equals within your household. And then, of course, if the opportunity to become free comes up for a slave, of course, seek it. He says that. So, he's just trying to find a way to spread Christianity, but not make it a religion of violence and the sword and that kind of thing. And so this is an explicit passage that says, obey the government that exists. And just for backing it up, what Paul says here, I'll just read to you what Peter says. This is 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 13. And now what Peter says should be very obvious to us. I shouldn't even need to explain it now that we've looked at all this other stuff. So Peter says, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Understand that the book of 1 Peter is addressed to a persecuted church. Alright. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the emperor. So that's, that would seem contradictory. It's like, if you honor the emperor, his authority is founded in the fact of comes from Zeus, And so if you honor the emperor, you're honoring Zeus. But I thought I was supposed to follow Jesus. Well, what he's saying is, yeah, you follow Jesus, but you find a way to get along with people because that's what Jesus wants you to do. Not because you're scared or anything, but because you follow Jesus. Okay. And he goes on to say in verse 18, servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing, when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you as an example, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed, for you were straying like sheep, but now have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. All right. So there you have it. And he goes on to say, he talk about wives who have evil husbands, and he's saying, be subject to your evil husbands, because in the Roman situation, women essentially would have been very similar to slaves, to their husbands. But he says, that you might be able to win them over. Now, this doesn't mean that like a woman necessarily should put up with abuse, or that it's right to put up with abuse. But he's saying, in this situation, the Roman government is completely anti everything Christians believe. And in that situation, you obey the government, but you try to find a way to, as much as you possibly can, you put up with every injustice that you can, because you're not here to spread Christianity by force. So that raises all sorts of other questions, but the important thing is that the Bible is not condoning slavery in any way. What's going on in the New Testament is, so now that we understand this, the basic concept is that Paul is not condoning slavery. The New Testament is not condoning slavery. That's clear. But they just sort of lead to a follow-up question, because they're not rebelling against slavery with violence and setting up their own government. But the reason they're not doing that is because in their situation, that would mean that would be illegal. That would be breaking the law. And while Paul and Peter are willing to break the law, and they are criminals just for being Christians, they're not willing to break the law in the case of slavery. Rather, they want to peacefully end slavery through winning over masters and slaves and then becoming Christians, and also peacefully end spousal abuse in marriages. Okay, so we begin to ask, well, what about today? What about, other situations? Most of us would feel like we were justified in using violence to, say there's spousal abuse in a marriage, or say, someone's enslaved. We would feel very justified in using violence to end that situation, to free that person from that situation. It seems very justified. The thing to understand is two things. One, Paul is not teaching total pacifism or, total nonviolent resistance. Even though he didn't use violence, he says in Romans 13 that the governments that exist have a God-given responsibility to punish evildoers with violence. Okay, so it's not like he's totally against the use of violence. But it's not going to be the way we're going to spread Christianity. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, on the one hand, there is a legitimate use of violence to punish evildoers, but on the other hand, we're not going to spread Christianity with violence, with war. Okay, so what that means is those are two extremes where in the one situation you could say, all right, let's go around and anyone who won't follow Jesus will cut their head off. That would be something Paul would be against. That's using violence to spread Christianity. In other words, forcing everything you believe on someone. But on the other end of the extreme, there's the government does have a legitimate role of punishing evildoers, which essentially, if let's say someone is a robber and the government comes in and uses violence to punish that person, well, you're forcing your beliefs on that robber. That robber thought it was okay to do that. So you're forcing your beliefs, if they're Christian beliefs, you're forcing that, you're shoving that down that person's throat. But, Paul says there's a legitimate role for government to use violence to punish evildoers. So we've got those two extremes where you're not going to force everything you believe on someone, but you're going to force some stuff. So the question we have to ask is, well, why didn't Peter and Paul say, all right, let's take up arms and start an army, and we'll create our little Christian government, and we're going to defeat the Roman Empire, or we're going to rebel and create this little separate government. Well, essentially, Christianity is a world takeover. So it's not going to be like, hey, this is Israel, a place where things are cool, come live here. That's the old way. The new way is the Great Commission, where Paul said, Jesus said in the Great Commission, go make disciples of all nations. So this is a full-blown invasion of the world, but it's a spiritual invasion of the world. The kingdom of God is coming, but it's within you. And Paul says to King Agrippa, King Agrippa, when he's on trial, says, are you trying to convince me to become a Christian, Paul? And Paul says, not only you, but absolutely every person in the world, I want them to become what I am, except for these chains. So their goal is a full-blown world takeover. But it's a spiritual takeover. They don't use violence they're doing everything they can to work within the system to change people's hearts, to end slavery within the home, to end spousal abuse within the home. So the question is, it would seem like rescuing someone from slavery or something like that is way on the end of the spectrum that seems justified, a justified use of violence to punish evildoers. The problem is the Roman situation. In the Roman situation, there's no difference between ending slavery and complete takeover of the Roman Empire. And since Peter and Paul's goal is complete takeover of the world with the kingdom of God, there's no way that they can rebel against slavery and not completely, start the two ends of the spectrum essentially become one. There's no distance between those ends, because from the Roman perspective, ending slavery is a full takeover of their empire. So for Peter and Paul, that's just not an option. They have to work, if they try to end slavery, then they're going to be forcing people to become Christians. They're going to be killing people for not being a Christian. There's no distinction between those two, because they can't just can't just create a little nation and carve out an area that's, for refugees or their little world, because that's not their agenda. Their agenda is go and make disciples of all nations, not stay, keep, and protect and guard the law or anything like that. So there you have it. Hopefully that makes some sense. Thank you for your time. One way to help you see the point that I'm making here is to think about it in modern times. So let's say that there's some serious spousal abuse going on in America today, or perhaps even there's some form of slavery going on today. Well, that's against the law in the United States. And, even if local law enforcement is in on it and supports it, you can go over their heads, and, you shouldn't put up with that. It's against the law, and it was always wrong. But if we go around to the other side of the world, so for example, in Saudi Arabia, they have something called, that basically translates to the religious police. And I was reading a story the other day of a girl who became a Christian, and she had to keep it secret because she didn't want her older brother to know, and because he was one of the religious police. He found out, and he gave her 4 hours to repent of her blasphemy, and she didn't repent, so he murdered her. And this was a legal execution over there. So that seems like some clear, not spousal abuse, but it's still, from our perspective, that's like a horrible abuse. That's straight murder. That's unjustified. How could something like that go on? How could that be part of the law? And then where slavery still goes on in the world today, it goes on in Muslim nations. Well, because Muhammad owned slaves. And so to Muslims, Sharia is the way to life. it is the way of salvation. And so Sharia means like following the teachings and the law of Muhammad. And at the heart of that is to be as much like the example of Muhammad as possible. So if Muhammad owned slaves, then it's okay to own slaves. So if you go over there and you say, hey, we're going to get rid of your religious police, you can't, do that anymore. Well, that's true to the teachings of Sharia, that you execute people who leave Islam. And if we say, no more slavery, y'all can't have slavery, then what we'd be doing is we'd be saying Muhammad was evil, so like, that's the issue. You are coming in and completely deciding what their religion is because of the way their religion is. So from Paul's teachings here, on the one hand, you can't go in, you can't just tell people what to believe. We're not going to go around cutting people's heads off if they don't follow Christ. But on the other hand, the government does have a God-given role to punish evildoers with violence. In the case of even today, in the case of these Muslim nations, you're not going to go get a machine gun and just go over there and just deal with it, are you? Even though these things that are going on, you'd say, well, I'm here to punish evildoers. Well, in your situation, you'd be fighting against their very religion, and you'd be forcing your religious beliefs on them in a way where you would basically be cutting off people's heads if they don't profess Christ. And we would say, well, that's evil. And we would understand what Paul means, with his situation. So that may help you understand what the Roman situation is like, applying it to a modern situation. There's just no way in Muslim nations to enforce what we believe to be basic human rights and basic laws without completely, bringing in our own religious violence and our own religious oppression. So you can't separate the two extremes for them. So maybe that helps you understand it in that situation today. So what we do, with Muslim nations is we try to convince them to change. We try to win the argument peacefully, because we're not going to go to the point of complete world takeover and forcing everyone to be a Christian. And in the case of a religion like Islam, you can't really separate punishing evildoers from forcing people to be Christian. So maybe that helps you understand it.